Okay, so today we're gonna show you guys how we go about making beanies, and we're just gonna start with the machine setup and actually knitting the tube that makes a beanie. So we talked in the video prior to this about the yarn, and I just kind of grabbed a random one for right now. I wound it around a cone so it pulls more easily and doesn't get into a knot, makes the knitting go by more quickly. And I usually set it down in a bowl kind of on the floor so it doesn't get yucky. And then you run the yarn up through the threading mechanism, however you want to call it.
Is there a technical name for that thing?
I don't know any technicalities at all when it comes to this machine. I figured it all out by myself.
Hence the notes.
Yeah, and I use it wrong. You're supposed to thread it through this guy so the tension of the yarn gets distributed evenly through the swipes, I'll just call them.
Passes?
Yeah, passes, but I don't use it because it hasn't worked for me. So I just thread it in the way that I found works for me. And then this little thing right here is called an eyelet. Thread it through the eyelet.
Yeah, we had a heck of a time finding those too, right? What were those?
The eyelets?
Strippers?
No, the strippers.
Wait, this is a different piece, huh?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
This is the
Never mind.
eyelet.
We'll get to the strippers later.
The strippers, while I'm threading this, you can show the strippers. These are the strippers. It's not coming out. I don't know. They come out, but they place tension, more tension on the yarn. There you go.
Hold on, can we put it back in there, right? Oh, nailed it.
Okay, so I got it through the eyelet, then I put it back into its little homing beacon, and then drop the yarn down through the bottom of the machine.
So, that little spot that you can kind of see in there is the middle of the machine, and that's where the yarn goes through. And you can kind of see the tips of the strippers in there, which, how do you explain what those do?
They place tension on the yarn as it's making its passes from left to right.
Cool.
So then I need to put it on the tubular setting, but first I have to close it off, meaning that it creates the finished edge at the bottom of the tube. I don't know why the machine has to work like that, but it's a vintage knitting machine, and that's how they
work.
Yeah, that's how they work. So I start with it on one setting, and then after I finish off the closed bottom, I move it to another setting.
And that's basically like what a sewing machine would do, where it's closing off an end so it can't come unraveled? Kind of?
Kind of. Yeah.
Kind of.
Ish.
Somewhat similar.
Not really. It's kind of just responsible for making the tubular structure.
Oh, okay.
And then there are stitch lengths that you have to set, which accounts for the distance between the stitches. For the yarn that I'm using, check my yarn log book here. And go to yarns that I've used, that I've kind of recorded, so I can measure it up against ones to figure out what the best stitch length should be. And I've already used this yarn. This is just a different color, and it says the stitch length should be set to 5.5. So I just adjust the dials there.
So what would that do if you were on a different setting that didn't work? It would just be too tight?
If I went down to a 1, it wouldn't even knit because it would be too tight. And if I went up to an 8, which is the highest setting, which allows for the most room, it would just look really
like stringy?
I guess very loose.
Mm-hmm.
And then let's see. I think for this yarn, a standard beanie was about 10 inches wide. So I have all my measurements down here that allow me to keep track of how wide I'm making the beanie. So I'll do a 10, so that's accounting for 20 inches of noggin. And yeah, I think I'm at a 12 right now.
So explain where the 12 is coming from?
I was at 12 inches wide. That was just what I had it
Oh,
set
so
to.
what are the
So-
labels on there actually? Like the 10,
These?
30, whatever, yeah.
I don't know.
Weird. Okay.
I just realized that these are inches, so I don't know. It starts at 1 and then it goes to 10, but then that's
Oh.
2 inches of space.
Weird.
So I have no
I wonder if
idea.
it's like some metric conversion or something.
It did come from Sweden. I don't know.
Not Sweden, Switzerland.
Switzerland, excuse me. So then I have to make sure that all of these needles here are open, which means that they can catch the yarn that's passing through.
Show me one that's closed.
Yeah, so
Looks like.
here they are closed,
Okay.
and here they are open.
Okay, so there's that like weird tiny little little doodad that moves on the end of them. Super tiny. All very, very tiny.
Okay, and then I have to push all of the I was gonna say noodles. All of the needles
We just ate noodles, so we know what's on the line.
up to
That
and
pho in the fridge though sounds good.
you can have it. I already had some today. I have to push all the needles up to an active working position, or so I've heard that's what it's called. Where they were before was inactive. Where they are now is active, meaning when I move this carriage to the next side, it is going to move yarn through it if I set it all up correctly. I also have to do it with the other side because we are knitting in a tube. So I need to account for an entire circle.
In case we didn't explain it in the other video, how long did it take to figure this out?
Okay. It would have taken me a couple weeks had I not been making one large mistake, which is what I am about to get to. But
Perfect segue.
it took me, I think in the blog post I wrote about it when I realized I was making that mistake, it had been like 60 something days of just like working on this for hours every day.
It's a lot of days.
It was very frustrating. So now everything is set up and ready to go for the initial stitch, which is going to be the zigzag that creates that closed off circle like I was talking about in the beginning. So I usually use my leg to hold the yarn in place, or I can use a paper clip or something, but I just don't have one. And I should go across here, and it makes a zigzag type of stitch. I don't know if you want to.
Yes. So that's
It goes
stitch, yeah.
back and forth and back and forth and back and forth for 10 inches in length.
So it did that all the way across. Shoop.
Yeah.
And you're gonna push it back.
Yes, I am. I usually go a couple times just to make sure that I've done it all correctly. So like the first, see, I already made a mistake here. So I had one needle in the working position that wasn't supposed to be in the working position, and it ended up messing up my thing here. But since I'm in the very beginning of it, I should be able to just drop that stitch by putting the needle in the non-working position, and I can just go for another swipe or two and then close it off to move on to the actual tube.
So you're just like sacrificing that one pass, kind of.
Yeah. So then I'm going to switch my setting, and if you noticed when it was going to the zigzag, it's going back and front to the two different beds. But when I switch it over to this setting here, which is setting X, it's going to knit only the front and then only the back. And that's basically what's creating the whole circle.
Oh, see, I didn't even know that. That's cool.
So and then you can come and see over here how it looks different now. You can start to see the little loops. I don't know if you can get it. There you go. You can start to see the these little knots starting to form, and that's what's making the actual stitches to do it. And speaking of the mistake that I made, I'm kind of making that mistake right now. I didn't add weight to this project. Weight is what provides tension into the bottom and allows all of this to move without getting stuck and then getting a resulting hole in your project.
Because what it would do is what? It would drop stitches if you didn't have the weight?
Yes.
Because there's nothing pulling it down to keep it coming?
So when I add weight, and I would have already paid for it if this yarn hadn't been such a heavy type of yarn. But I end up putting this guy here that holds all of these little different weights onto the bottom of the yarn and up through the top. I have to move this.
Yep.
Oh, and I did actually drop a stitch.
You need to pull it?
That's good.
And the ever so critical beer by your side throughout the entire process.
Yes. Very critical. So I dropped some stitches, which means that I have to go through and either fix them individually, or if there are too many, I would just start the project over again. Basically involves taking the yarn that you ended up messing up and feeding it through the needle that it did not get fed through. I might have gone too far on this, and I might have to start it over though. So I messed up the first one, and I just ended up starting over because it would have taken me more time to fix the drop stitches than to just go ahead and start from scratch. So I'm applying my weight holding
Majig.
thing, yeah. And I basically shimmy it up to the front and try and get it as even as I can, meaning I try to like center it. And then this little very long wire or needle ends up going through all of these holes. It's basically like a comb, but with a ton of holes in it.
So it's like blocking off the...
Yes. It's just creating a hold. So now it drops and it provides weight. But I need more weight, so I'm going to attach them to the bottoms, which is again, I center it. Ow, that was my head. 1 and 2.
It's funny, it seems all the way up in there.
Yeah. And you're gonna have to scoot over. So I attached 3, and then I have heavier ones for heavier weighted yarns. Or if I just like get to a project that needs more tension, then I use the heavier weight to apply more tension. So I'm gonna run it back and forth in the zigzag stitch like I talked about before. And it all looks good, and you can probably see now more of the tension that's placed. It pulls it all down.
Mm-hmm.
So before it looked kind of fluffy, and that's why all of the stitches were dropping, whereas now all of those stitches are pulled down tightly.
Cool.
So then I switch to the tubular setting, and then I just basically keep going until I have a tube that's long enough to create the beanie that I want. So if I want a slouchy beanie, it's going to end up being a little shorter. If I want like your typical beanie that you wear like everywhere or whatever, it's going to be a little longer because those end up getting folded over twice, which is what makes them actually warm. So yeah, just keep going.
How many times do you typically keep going? Because like for different heads, like I'm assuming some people like the beanies a little deeper. Like when we were doing a couple of the first ones, they were a little more shallow. Like how many passes do you typically need to do before you're at a good spot?
Hundreds.
Woo!
Like,
It's more like time than it is passes. Do you like, so do you measure once it starts to come out of the bottom, do you measure how long it is and that's how you know?
I just know how to gauge it. Now if I have someone who wants something like super specific, then I'll measure it exactly. But for a regular beanie, I'm just comfortable with noticing when the length is as long as it needs to be, which is like I would say like a little over 2 feet, because you want enough to like double wrap it and then fold it over for that brim that they usually have.
Gotcha.
So. So it's being knitted right here and coming out from the two beds, from between the two beds here in a tube. And there are the weights that I attached up in there to begin with. So now I have a tube that's long enough to double over to make an actual beanie. So I'm gonna now take the tube off of the knitting machine. And I do that by cutting the yarn and lifting up all of the needles. And then I take the weight tool to just kind of shift all the needles into a closed position, and then this whole side is now dropped and free. So I'm going to do the same thing with the other side. Close the needles, and then it's going to fall out at the bottom, which I'm going to catch before it gets to the floor.
Voila!
Now,
Le tube.
doesn't look like a beanie yet, but it's the start of one. So right now it kind of looks like a scarf, and it definitely could be if you wanted it to be that, but for the beanie, you're going to fold it in on itself. And it looks small, but this yarn has a lot of stretch. It's also insanely comfortable.
I was just gonna say the most friggin'
Yeah.
comfortable thing I've ever put on my noggin.
Yeah, this is like the softest yarn ever. So here, this is just the tail from the inside, which I will cut later. So now you can see what will eventually be a beanie, because this would be the brim like you would normally see there.
Yep.
And what I'm gonna do in the next video is show you guys how I cut the form for the beanie, and then how I sew it together, and then sew the patch or the tag on, and then I'll be done. So there you go.
Check you later.